The situation is escalating faster than anyone expected, and if you blink now, you will miss the very detail everyone is going to be talking about by tomorrow morning. What we are looking at tonight is not a rumor, not a recycled headline, but a series of revelations resurfacing from sources who insist this is where the real timeline begins. According to people familiar with the matter, the earliest thread connecting Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew traces back to Toronto in the year 2013, a connection the public was never meant to see, and one insider's claim was carefully kept off the record for years. Back then, Meghan was in Canada filming her breakout legal drama, living what many believed was an ordinary actress's routine. But new commentary from those close to the royal beat suggests the picture was far from simple. They point out that Prince Andrew was allegedly in Toronto that same September, staying less than 5 minutes from Meghan's residence. The proximity alone, just 4 blocks, has become the first major flashpoint of tonight's story. One insider described it as a coincidence, far too neat to be dismissed, while another stressed that the meeting wasn't part of any official schedule and certainly wasn't meant for public knowledge. The narrative becomes sharper when we revisit how little of that period was documented. No official diary entry for Andrew, no public engagement logs, no acknowledgement from Meghan's camp, just a month in which both individuals occupied the same compact corner of Toronto and, according to several people who claim awareness of the situation, shared at least one discrete interaction. Viewers familiar with royal history know that when gaps appear in the paper trail, speculation fills them quickly. But in this case, commentators argue that the absence of documentation is precisely what makes the timeline so compelling. Observers on royal forums have long wondered why this moment remained untouched by mainstream coverage, even as other aspects of Meghan's life were combed through relentlessly after she entered the royal orbit. One analyst put it bluntly, if this meeting happened and multiple insiders maintain that it did, it would reshape the entire understanding of how Meghan first entered circles loosely linked to the York family. That's a strong assessment, and it is echoed across several independent sources who maintain there was more movement behind the scenes than the public was ever allowed to see. Tonight's examination of that period is not about suggesting clear wrongdoing. Rather, it is about understanding how a pattern of overlapping networks began to take shape long before the world ever associated Meghan with Prince Harry. Toronto becomes the opening chapter of a much wider narrative involving New York, the York sisters, Soho House, private flights, and high-profile social connectors, threads that, according to insiders, form a map more intricate than previously recognized. But before we move forward, it is crucial to note how this seemingly small detail, 1 month, 1 city, 1 alleged meeting, has returned to dominate discussions among those tracking the evolving tension inside the palace. Analysts with experience covering the monarchy insist this is the moment where everything starts making sense. Why certain friendships developed, why certain introductions were made, and why later events seem less accidental in hindsight. Some of them stop just short of calling it a turning point. Others do not hesitate at all. And all of this leads to the question viewers are already debating in real time. If Toronto was indeed the quiet beginning, why was it buried for so long? Who had the most to gain from keeping it off the radar? And why are insiders speaking up now? What comes next will take us from Toronto to New York, where the connections grow denser, the relationships more layered, and the implications far harder for the palace to ignore. Stay where you are because this timeline is only getting sharper, and the pieces ahead will change how you interpret everything that followed. The connections deepen quickly, and what unfolds next is where commentators say the landscape shifts from coincidence into a pattern that refuses to be ignored. We move from Toronto to New York, an environment Meghan knew well in the mid-2010s, and a city insiders insist became the central hub linking her to the York Circle long before the spotlight found her. This is where the story expands, gathering speed, and it is why royal watchers claim that anyone trying to understand the roots of the current crisis must pay close attention to what happened during those years. According to people familiar with the social scene at the time, Meghan was spending extended periods in New York, mingling in the same small, curated pockets of society that Princess Eugenie and Princess Beatrice frequented. It wasn't just proximity, it was overlap shared friends, shared events, and, in several cases, shared insiders who acted as go-betweens. One commentator who has covered the York sisters for over a decade described it as a tightly wound ecosystem where introductions rarely happen by accident. Another added that if you were moving through elite New York circles in that era, you ended up crossing paths with the Yorks whether you intended to or not. Photos from the period, resurfacing across forums and royal analysis channels, show a network forming quietly in the background. Meghan's stylist posts an image. Weeks later, the same individual appears in a post with Eugenie. A private dinner appears on someone's Instagram story. Nothing explicit, nothing incriminating, but always the same constellation of faces orbiting one another. Critics argue that these are standard coincidences in a city like New York, but insiders counter that these overlaps were far too consistent to chalk up to randomness, especially given the exclusivity of the venues involved. And that brings us to the figure who, according to nearly every royal watcher, is unavoidable at this stage: Marcus Anderson. His presence is the thread stitching New York, Toronto, and London together. Meghan has referred to him as one of her closest companions, and the record supports that claim. Anderson appears in travel photos, restaurant shots, backstage glimpses, and the kinds of candid moments that only inner circle confidants are privy to. But what makes Anderson so pivotal to this timeline is not just his friendship with Meghan, it is his long-standing closeness with the York sisters. Sources familiar with Soho House operations describe Anderson as someone who operated at a level above traditional hospitality. He wasn't simply a director, he was a gatekeeper. His job wasn't to pour drinks or schedule tables, it was to curate people who met who should be introduced, who needed access, and who needed distance. As one insider put it, Marcus didn't host parties. He engineered social ecosystems. And those ecosystems routinely included Eugenie and Beatrice, both known to frequent Soho House events for their privacy and exclusivity. Commentators say this is where the connection between Meghan and the Yorks becomes less theoretical and more functional. Anderson, trusted by the princesses, was also the person guiding Meghan into elite circles during the years she was transitioning from cable television notoriety to global household name. The suggestion, repeated by several industry voices, is that through Anderson, Meghan and the York sisters were not just adjacent, they were intersecting. This network created a foundation that explains, at least in the view of insiders, why Meghan's eventual entry into royal life felt unusually smooth in its earliest stages. She didn't arrive as a stranger, one royal correspondent noted. She arrived as someone the Yorks already understood. That interpretation has gained traction as new details continue to surface about the depth of Anderson's role in shaping Meghan's social trajectory. But the more striking development highlighted by analysts is how this New York web places Meghan and the York circle within the same orbit as figures connected to Prince Andrew. Not in the sensationalized way tabloids sometimes imply, but in the straightforward reality that social worlds at this level overlap, especially when Soho House is involved. The York sisters were closer to Andrew's world than any other branch of the family. Anderson was close to the York sisters. Meghan was close to Anderson, and New York was the city where those lines converged. Insiders who have worked around the Yorks for years say this overlap was common knowledge in private circles, but was largely dismissed by mainstream coverage because it lacked a headline-friendly angle until now, as new accounts begin resurfacing and reframing that period through a harsher and more scrutinizing lens. And so the question grows louder. Were these intersections simply the byproduct of a tightly knit elite, Or were they early indicators of a much larger web that would eventually pull Meghan into the gravitational field of Andrew's controversies? The next stage of this story leads directly to the person many insiders identify as the defining link, the architect of access, the silent observer, the man whose shadow appears in every timeline of this saga. That is where the narrative turns from coincidence into structure, and where the implications become far more difficult to dismiss. The pace accelerates here, because once Marcus Anderson steps fully into the frame, the entire pattern stops looking accidental. Commentators say that if Toronto was the spark and New York was the atmosphere, then Anderson is the oxygen that turned everything into a sustained flame, a constant presence, a consistent connector, and, according to several insiders, the individual who understood the movements of Meghan, the York sisters, and the wider Soho House network better than anyone else in that era. Viewers familiar with the elite social circuit already know his reputation: polished, discreet, impeccably placed. But the deeper analysis emerging now paints him not just as a facilitator of social introductions, but as the architect behind a high-level ecosystem that blurred boundaries between celebrity access, royal proximity, and exclusive global circles. One longtime observer described him as the person everyone knew but no one ever questioned. The sort of operator who could glide through a room without leaving a trace, yet somehow everyone present would later mention him as the person who made things happen. His rise within Soho House is often cited as the first clue that his role transcended standard hospitality. He joined when the London club was still establishing itself, and rose with unusual speed, a trajectory insiders still raise eyebrows at. By the time he reached his 40s, Soho House founder Nick Jones had launched a wine line inspired by Anderson Lady A, an honor commentators say is almost unheard of for a staff member. One industry analyst framed it bluntly: that doesn't happen unless your influence goes way beyond your job description. And that influence is precisely what brings Anderson into the center of tonight's narrative. According to former members and associates who spoke anonymously to maintain their privacy, Anderson wasn't simply managing membership lists. He was strategically curating who entered which room, who shared which table, and who met whom. They describe him as someone with an instinct for pairing personalities, bridging introductions, and shaping social momentum across continents. Toronto, New York, London, his fingerprint appears in each city connected to Meghan's pre-royal trajectory. Crucially, Anderson's long-standing closeness with Princess Eugenie predates Meghan by several years. Those familiar with the York sisters emphasize that they trusted him implicitly, often choosing Soho House locations and events precisely because of the privacy and discretion he guaranteed. That trust extended into their wider social world: friends, stylists, party organizers, private dinners, many of which Meghan eventually entered. Commentators reviewing the timeline have pointed out that Meghan's integration into London's elite social circles appears almost frictionless once she began spending more time with Anderson. One analyst summarized the pattern as a well-paved road rather than a spontaneous merging, and given Anderson's proximity to the Yorks, that interpretation has gained momentum among those watching the story unfold. They argue that Meghan's eventual ease within certain royal-adjacent environments makes significantly more sense through the lens of Anderson's involvement. But it's not just about introductions. It's also about geography and opportunity. Anderson travelled frequently, and he travelled with Meghan Paris, New York, London, the types of trips that require more than friendship to maintain consistency. Those familiar with their dynamic claim he was often in the background during pivotal transitions. Her growing presence at New York events, her increased time in London, even the early days of her relationship with Prince Harry. He wasn't visible, but he was there, one source noted. As this picture becomes clearer, analysts point out the inevitable connection this creates to Prince Andrew's world. Not through scandal, but through structure. The York sisters remain Andrew's closest allies within the family, and their social environment often intersected with his by association. When Meghan entered their sphere, facilitated in part by Anderson, she entered a world shaped by both privilege and proximity to Andrew's circle. That context alone, according to insiders, is what makes lawyers, biographers, and commentators revisit this timeline with renewed attention. What amplifies the tension now is the role of Ron Burkle. His ownership stake in Soho House, his collection of high-profile connections, and his occasional involvement in Meghan's travel logistics, most notably the private flights, add another layer to the story. Analysts describe this as a web of overlapping access points, not implying wrongdoing, but emphasizing the interconnectedness of the individuals who appear repeatedly across these locations and events. Anderson's presence at the center of it all is why observers maintain he is the key to understanding how Meghan moved through these exclusive spaces long before the world imagined she would become a duchess. His role was quiet, but foundational. Everything from the New York intersections to the London introductions becomes sharper when viewed through his influence. Which leads us to the next development, one that shifts the narrative from social architecture to direct contradictions, resurfaced photos, and statements that no longer align. Because when the focus moves from Anderson to the events in Jamaica, the story stops being about proximity and starts being about exposure, timing, and questions the palace has avoided addressing for years. The shift happens abruptly here because this is the moment insiders say the narrative stops being a subtle pattern and turns into a direct contradiction, one that has lingered for years without proper scrutiny. We're looking at Jamaica, early 2017, a wedding that seemed like a harmless social gathering at the time, but has since become a pressure point for analysts reviewing the timeline. The reason is simple. Several statements made later do not align cleanly with what appears to have happened there, and commentators are now re-examining every detail with renewed urgency. According to multiple people familiar with royal social events from that period, the wedding of Tom Inskip brought together a surprisingly concentrated group of individuals connected directly or indirectly to the York circle. Photos from guests, resurfacing over the years, show Sarah Ferguson standing beside Princess Eugenie, smiling for snapshots that were shared casually at the time. Nothing unusual about that. What complicates the picture is the claim from several sources that Meghan was also present at the celebration, reportedly flown in on a private aircraft arranged through associates she knew well by then. Observers note that this point has become one of the most debated moments in the broader timeline. Meghan's attendance was never publicly emphasized, but people who were part of the group insist she was there. Meanwhile, Ferguson, commonly known as Fergie, later stated in interviews that she had never met Meghan before the royal wedding. That line stood for years as part of the official narrative, until commentators began noting that if Meghan was indeed present at the Jamaica event, the phrasing becomes difficult to reconcile with guest accounts. No one is accusing Fergie of deliberate deception, but insiders suggest that public-facing statements often simplify reality for the sake of palace consistency. One commentator phrased it carefully. Official narratives sometimes shift for cohesion. The Jamaica timeline simply doesn't slot neatly into the version that was later presented. Another insider added that certain interactions at high-profile social events don't always register as significant at the time, implying that a brief encounter might not have felt notable enough for a public figure to mention later. But it's not the possibility of an overlooked introduction that draws attention, it's the convergence of individuals at this particular wedding. Analysts note that the York sisters were there, Fergie was there, several members of the extended royal social circle were there. And if Meghan was present, as multiple guests believe, the overlap becomes striking given the narrative that would later place Meghan as a total outsider entering the royal world through Harry alone. Commentators reviewing guest lists and photographic evidence say the real issue isn't about whether conversations took place. It's about how this moment reshapes public assumptions. It reframes the context. one media analyst explained. It suggests Meghan wasn't entering the royal environment cold. She may have already been on the edges of that orbit, facilitated by connections through Anderson, the Yorks, and mutual friends. Observers point out that the Jamaica event also serves as a bridge between Meghan's New York-Toronto social world and the more insulated environment of London's royal-adjacent gatherings. Several insiders describe the atmosphere as informal but influential, the type of setting where people observe one another, take mental notes, and assess new faces quietly. In that sense, whether Meghan interacted directly with Fergie or simply existed in the same social space, her presence becomes significant within the broader narrative being reconstructed now. What intensifies discussion is the claim that Prince Andrew may also have been linked to the event indirectly through family presence and overlapping social groups. There is no definitive confirmation of his attendance, but his proximity to the York Circle at the time has prompted ongoing commentary. Analysts are careful here, emphasizing that what matters is the environment rather than the assumption of interaction. The Jamaica weekend placed Meghan, the York sisters, and possibly individuals linked to Andrew's extended network in the same small, contained setting, something earlier public narratives never highlighted. Royal watchers have noted that, in retrospect, the Jamaica timeline may have been downplayed simply because it complicated the cleaner, more romantic version of Meghan's entry into royal life. As one longtime commentator put it, the palace prefers origin stories that are simple, linear, and easy to communicate. Jamaica introduces nuance. Nuance is rarely convenient, and this nuance is precisely what leads commentators toward the next major development. The resurfacing of correspondence involving Fergie and Ghislaine Maxwell, and the way those leaked communications reshaped the public's understanding of who knew whom, when they knew them, and how far back certain connections truly go. Because if Jamaica raised questions about proximity and timing, the email trail raises questions about transparency, loyalty, and the shifting alliances inside the palace, pressure points that insiders say are still reverberating today. The tension sharpens significantly here, because this is the point where the timeline intersects with a set of leaked communications that commentators say changed the tone of the entire discussion. For years, the relationship between Sarah Ferguson and Ghislaine Maxwell was treated cautiously in public narratives, acknowledged in broad strokes, but rarely dissected. That changed when emails, allegedly exchanged between the two women, began surfacing through selective leaks. Those familiar with the situation emphasize that these messages do not necessarily prove wrongdoing, but they do reopen questions about earlier public statements and force analysts to reconsider the internal dynamics shaping the royal response at the time. Insiders following the story closely note that these leaked emails were not released by accident. They were, according to several observers, part of a strategy deliberate, timed, and aimed at shifting attention away from certain individuals while amplifying scrutiny on others. One commentator who has monitored Maxwell's legal developments described the leaks as a defensive maneuver, suggesting they were intended to redirect pressure outward. When people find themselves cornered, the analyst explained, they use whatever leverage they have, and correspondence like this can become currency. The discovery of the emails reignited debate about how much Andrew and Fergie knew about Maxwell in earlier decades, and whether their public distancing in later years was consistent with private communications now coming to light. Commentators are careful here. They stress that leaked messages do not automatically equal scandal, but they do complicate the narrative that both parties had severed ties long before legal troubles escalated. The inconsistencies, real or perceived, have prompted renewed scrutiny not just from the public, but reportedly from within palace circles as well. What intensifies the situation further is the claim from palace insiders that not everyone in the royal household agreed on how to manage the fallout. According to sources familiar with internal discussions, There was a growing faction led by those close to Prince William who believed that continued protection of Andrew was damaging the institution's public standing. One insider articulated it bluntly. The tolerance threshold collapsed. William didn't want any ambiguity left around the issue. Analysts observing his public posture over the past few years say this assessment aligns with his increasingly firm tone on matters involving royal accountability. Meanwhile, Parliament's role in the broader controversy remains a point of contention. Lawmakers have repeatedly deferred responsibility back to the monarchy, while the monarchy has quietly suggested these matters fall under parliamentary oversight. Commentators describe this as a circular exchange of accountability, where both sides hope the other will make the first decisive move. The result has been a vacuum, one that fuels speculation, frustration, and a sense that the situation is being managed rather than resolved. This environment of institutional hesitation created fertile ground for the email leaks to gain traction. Each new snippet, whether authenticated or simply circulated, became a catalyst for commentary, especially from analysts who believe transparency is the only path forward. One senior royal correspondent noted that leaks don't create scandals. They expose the fractures underneath, suggesting that the public's renewed curiosity stems from long-standing inconsistencies rather than the emails alone. The wider implication, highlighted across media commentary, is that these communications may only represent a fraction of what exists. Observers familiar with the legal landscape warn that additional material, possibly far more extensive, could still emerge. That possibility has increased pressure inside the palace, where the goal appears to be preventing further narrative slippage. Insiders describe an atmosphere defined by caution, calculated distancing, and a strong desire to prevent any new developments from tying the Sussex-era tensions to the lingering fallout surrounding Andrew. What becomes clear in this stage of the timeline is that the email leaks were not an isolated incident. They became the accelerant for a series of quiet reassessments within the palace, within Parliament, and within the broader public conversation. And it's precisely at this point in the story that another explosive detail resurfaces: the claim that Meghan Markle herself was once considered a potential witness in proceedings related to Andrew. That revelation, according to commentators, reframes everything we've examined so far and opens the door to a new series of questions that extend far beyond leaked messages. The revelation lands with a weight that immediately shifts the energy in the room, because this is where the discussion moves from overlapping social circles and resurfaced timelines into territory that legal analysts describe as substantive enough to merit professional consideration. According to several commentators revisiting the period, the detail that Virginia Giuffre's lawyer, David Boies, once contemplated calling Meghan Markle for a deposition in matters related to Prince Andrew is not just another footnote, it's the pivot point that forces a reassessment of almost every earlier intersection. Observers stress that being considered for questioning does not imply involvement. What it does imply, according to legal experts familiar with high-profile cases, is that the individual is believed to possess information contextual, peripheral, or clarifying that might help shape a broader understanding of timelines and relationships. One analyst articulated it carefully: lawyers don't cast wide nets in cases with this level of sensitivity. If they consider calling someone, it's because they believe that person saw or heard something relevant, even if indirectly. Insiders familiar with the York Circle argue that this possibility makes sense within the expanded timeline we've been examining. Meghan spent extended periods within social environments linked, via friends or social venues, to individuals on the periphery of Andrew's world. She knew Princess Eugenie well, and Eugenie has long been regarded as Andrew's closest familial ally. Marcus Anderson, Meghan's confidant, was firmly embedded in the social architecture surrounding both the York sisters and Soho House, a venue repeatedly mentioned by those who analyse royal-adjacent networks. Commentators say this context is what likely placed Meghan on the radar of Boy's legal team. Not because she was involved, but because she existed close enough to the York ecosystem that her recollections, if ever requested, might have clarified who was present where, who knew whom, or what social dynamics looked like during the years before the controversies erupted publicly. Those familiar with royal legal matters emphasize that the mere consideration of her name is what raises eyebrows, not as an accusation, but as a sign of how complex the interpersonal webs had become behind palace walls. What draws even more attention now is the way this possibility intersects with palace strategy. Analysts believe the monarchy has been operating on two parallel tracks, insulating the institution from the fallout surrounding Andrew, and preventing any renewed scrutiny from overlapping with the already strained dynamics involving Meghan and Prince Harry. One insider described it as a containment model, suggesting the royal household had no interest in allowing these timelines to bleed into each other publicly. Two separate fires, the insider said. The palace didn't want them merging. However, the resurfacing of Andrew Lownie's ongoing research, reportedly expanded by over 60 pages of new material, has made that separation increasingly difficult to maintain. Commentators speculate that the extended research may highlight political ties, historical correspondences, and additional accounts from sources who previously chose silence. The potential scope of that upcoming material has already sparked renewed conversation across royal analysis channels, many of which ask the same question: how wide will the circle expand this time? Observers agree that the broader public's interest is driven not by sensationalism, but by the lack of clarity. People want to understand how different figures moved through the same spaces without those intersections being acknowledged openly. They want to know whether the palace's carefully crafted narratives were designed for protection, convenience, or both. And they want to know how much of the timeline remains unexamined simply because it never fit neatly into the official record. What remains uncontested among analysts is that Meghan's proximity to the York network through friendships, social events, and intermediaries like Marcus Anderson continues to influence how commentators interpret her early years within royal circles. Whether or not she ever possessed information of legal relevance, her placement in the social landscape has made her impossible to exclude from retrospective analysis. As we review the entire sequence from Toronto to New York to Jamaica to the email leaks and now to the legal consideration, the narrative forms a pattern that continues to evolve with every new release, every new source, and every new piece of context brought forward by those who lived at the edges of the story. This is an unfolding network, not a closed chapter, and analysts believe more revelations are inevitable. Thank you for watching, and if you want deeper dives into the connections, the timelines, and the shifting palace dynamics, make sure you subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, and stay tuned because this conversation is far from over.